Mike.
Good afternoon. Going to get into the violence for June. So June, we saw 39 murder victims with 0 reclassifications. Out of the 39 murder victims, 28 were gunshot victims. That's 72% of our murder victims. That's usually around 55%. When we look at the method, 28 were shot, 7 were cut, 4 were forced. Outside murders, 33 out of 39, or 85%, were outside. Let's take a look at last year, 13 or 45%. Let's look at our gang motives. 28% of our murders in June were gang motivated. Let's look at last year, 3%. 51% of our murders in June had a gang nexus. 2019, 17%. When we look at the victims, all murder victims in June were of the minority community. Let's look at the parole population. 19% of our murders in June, a parolee was involved. Last year, 3%. When we look at the
statistics,
male-female breakdown, 35 were male, 4 were female. Let's take you to the beginning of July. These numbers that I'm giving you, we have to go back to 1996 and 1995 to get higher numbers. I'll take you back to 1996. Over 2,500 shooting incidents, almost 3,000 shooting victims, and almost 1,000 murders. These numbers that we're talking about today are not numbers. Guess what? They're victims. Let's see what 2019 ended up. 319 murder victims, still way too high. 777 shooting incidents, way too high. 923 victims. But we come a long way from 1996. Let's look at July's murders. 14 out of 16, or 88%, have been victims of gunshot. I've been looking at this for a long time. When I look at what it usually is, I said it's about 55%. 69% were outside so far in July, and also all the murder victims in July have been of the minority community. Let's talk about shootings. 205 shooting incidences in June with 270 victims. That's an increase of 164 shooting victims. When we look at street shootings, 72% of our shootings happened on a New York City street. When I look back to 2019, the percentage of shooting incidents on the street, 58%. Over 50% of our shootings have a crew nexus. When I look at the victims, 97% of our shooting victims in June were of the minority community. And in July, all our shooting victims have been of the minority community. Again, when we look at our parolee population, and I know we're going to get into Rikers releases, and I'll speak about Rikers releases, and I'll also speak about the 2,500 individuals that were released early because of COVID. And I just want to remind everybody, 75% of those releasees were convicted felons. And the NYPD did have a voice, and our voice was ignored. We recommended 96% of that population not to be released. It was ignored. And now we have more victims, and we see the lawlessness on the streets. When we look at where the shootings are happening, almost half of the shootings in June are in 10 precincts. 10. Almost half. There's 77 precincts in New York City, ladies and gentlemen. And almost half of the shootings happened in 10 precincts. And if you want to stretch it to 15, then we're going over 60%. Those communities are being overrun by the small percentage of gang members who have no regard for their own life and absolutely zero regard for the community. I'd just like to touch on commercial burglaries, grand larcenies of an auto. In June, we continue to struggle with burglary and grand larceny of an auto. It's very simply tied to the following factors. And I'd love to share the data that I have, the empirical data and the anecdotal evidence that I have, that my office has, that my data scientists work at, that the men and women continue to get the data behind it. I'm not sitting up here not giving you data. Burglaries, robberies prior to the pandemic were clearly driven by bail reform laws. When you look at it